right, everyone, we are back this week talking about the urinary system first and then the reproductive system. So, urinary system chapter isn't huge. We're going to go into just a little bit of detail about function of the urinary system, especially the kidneys, since that's the main functional unit. But we're not going to go into an immense amount of detail. That would definitely come later in your education, depending on what pathway you choose. So our urinary system is working constantly to clean or filter our blood. Doesn't require us to think about this. We do not have to put any conscious thought into it, which is a really good thing because it needs to be working constantly. And our urinary system is really, really good at keeping the things that we need to keep, like water and electrolytes, and then discarding everything else that we do not need. So section 2 is just kind of an overview of the different main parts of the kidney, and then in another video we'll get into the following section, focused a little bit more on some of that function. So kidneys are located on the posterior abdominal wall, so pretty close to the back of the body, near the spine. They are considered to be retroperitoneal, so that peritoneal cavity that we learned about with the digestive system. Retro means behind, so the kidneys are behind that peritoneal cavity. They have some different methods of being protected. One is from the rib cage, so the lower portion of the rib cage, as well as muscle and some fats, because these are really important structures, so we need to protect them. Their exact placement is going to vary a little bit from person to person, but usually somewhere in between thoracic vertebrae 12 and lumbar vertebrae 3 is where they're going to be found. The left kidney does sit a little bit higher up than the right kidney because of the liver placement. And then, as we saw with the urinary system in lab last week, the adrenal glands are located right on top of the kidneys. So this is kind of what that looks like. So here's our vertebrae. So there's thoracic vertebrae 10 down to lumbar vertebrae 5. So the kidneys are in that thoracic 12 to lumbar vertebrae 3 region. We've got our kidneys here, protected again by that lower portion of the rib cage, so those false and floating ribs. And then there's also going to be a lot of muscle and fat padding, both in front, sideways, and behind them. So externally, the kidney or renal external anatomy, so renal means kidney. First we have the renal fascia. This is connective tissue that's going to anchor the kidneys in place within the body. So it's just going to be some connective tissue kind of sitting around here, making sure that they stay in that approximate placement. Then we have the renal fat pad to help cushion and protect them. And then the renal capsule, which we did learn in lab already. This is, again, connective tissue to help further protect and hold the shape of the kidneys. Next up, the renal hilum. This is an important area, although we didn't cover it in lab. This is basically where blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, nerves, and the ureters are all entering and or exiting the kidneys. We'll see a picture of that in just a little bit. And getting a bit more internal, a lot of these we've talked about already in lab, so I'm not going to take a lot of time on them right now, but we've got that outer cortex, inner medulla. We have renal lobes. We didn't cover this term specifically, but this is going to be smaller sections and are going to have the renal columns, the renal pyramids, and the renal papilla. And then we get further in with the minor and major calyx, and then the renal pelvis. So kind of zooming in on this image. So this kind of indentation area right here on the kidney, that is the hilum. And so the renal artery, renal veins are going to be passing through there. The renal pelvis into that ureter are going to be passing through there, as well as, again, nerves and lymphatic vessels. And then most of the rest of these structures we covered in lab, so I don't want to take too much time to cover them again right now. But again, cortex medulla is this inner portion. We've got renal pyramids, the renal papilla at the base, into the minor calyx, which fuse into the major calyx, and then into the renal pelvis. So we're going to keep moving on since this was all covered in lab. So there are a lot of blood vessels that pass through the kidney, which makes sense since our kidneys are filtering our blood. So it makes tons of sense to have tons and tons of vessels going through there. Our starting point is the renal artery, so coming out of the abdominal aorta. It will then branch into segmental arteries and then interlobar arteries, arcuate arteries, and then we have another type of interlobar artery, also sometimes called the cortical radiate artery, and then the afferent arteriole, which will then pass into the glomerulus or glomerular capillaries, and then from there out the efferent arteriole. So there's a lot of blood vessels passing through the kidney, and there are going to be multiples of most of these except for that renal artery. So the rest of these are all going to have multiple vessels that fit that particular name. And then we also have peritubular capillaries. They're going to surround the nephron. We'll talk about those a little bit more in a minute. The vasa recta, which are another type of capillary. Then we have venules, interlobar veins, arcuate veins, more interlobar veins, and then the renal vein taking blood back to the inferior vena cava. So this graphic shows these different vessels kind of starting, so we can kind of follow this pathway in gray here through how this blood flow goes through the kidneys. So again, coming in at the renal artery, it will then pass into that segmental artery, into an interlobar artery. It can go a couple different directions there, as you can see. And then we have arcuate artery, another interlobar artery up here. And at that point, we can zoom in a bit more around this nephron loop right here. And there we have the afferent arteriole, so taking blood into that glomerulus, into all those capillaries. And then that blood will leave the renal corpuscle here through the efferent arteriole, and then that kind of feeds into this peritubular capillary system right here, which is surrounding the proximal and distal convoluted tubules, as well as that nephron loop again. And this is so that we can still have secretion and absorption of different materials as that filtrate is passing through this tube system. And then from those peritubular capillaries, we'll pass into the interlobar veins, arcuate veins, more interlobar veins, and then the renal vein. So the nephron is kind of the big workhorse of our urinary system. It is what's called the functional unit of the kidney because it's what's doing the filtration. And this is made up of basically the renal corpuscle, which is the glomerulus or glomerular capillaries, plus Bowman's capsule or glomerular capsule, then the proximal convoluted tubule, entire nephron loop, also known as the loop of Henle, and then the distal convoluted tubule. So again, here's our nephron shown in purple in this particular image. So that glomerular capsule is that layer of cells. The glomerulus itself is again actual capillaries. So they're also called the glomerular capillaries sometimes. And then we can have that blood filtered out, and from there it will pass through that proximal convoluted tubule, then through the nephron loop, which will be the descending limb, and then the ascending limb, then through that distal convoluted tubule into the collecting duct. There are a couple different types of nephrons that are found in the kidneys, depending on their location within either the cortex or medulla. So we have cortical nephrons. So these are nephrons that are going to be found primarily in the cortex region of the kidney. So this is where the loop of Henle barely dips down into that medullary region. And then we have juxtamedullary nephrons. So this is where we're going to have that loop of Henle, or the nephron loop, is much, much longer and is going to dip a lot further down into the medulla region. And so most of the nephrons are going to be these cortical nephrons. About 15% of them are going to be the juxtamedullary nephrons. Everything else will be cortical nephrons. And the name is mostly just based on where their location is. We'll go into a bit more detail about their function in another video, but this is why when we looked at some of the models for the urinary system last week in lab, you saw that sometimes those nephrons were located in some different regions and were kind of offset from each other. All right, so just kind of view that. So this region right here that's lighter in color, that would be the cortex, and then down here would be the medulla region. And so here would be a cortical nephron right here, where most of that structure is located in the cortex. And then here we have the juxtamedullary nephron right here, where it's extending far down into that medullary region. All right, we will wrap up this video here and continue in the next one, talking a bit more in detail about this microscopic anatomy of the kidney and how some of this filtration happens.